Thank you very much for helping us out this way, Father. Could you explain a little bit of your background?
Yes, thank you, Bay. I appreciate your invitation. I'm happy to speak with you and to the viewers who will be participating in this retreat and prayer experience that you have sponsored. So yes, I am a Catholic priest of the Archdiocese of New York. I was ordained in 1984. Cardinal O'Connor ordained me a priest. I had studied at St. Joseph's Seminary, Dunwoody, which is the Archdiocesan Seminary here in New York. I was a parish priest for 9 years in different parishes in Manhattan and the Bronx before Cardinal O'Connor sent me to Rome, where I studied canon law at the Pontifical Gregorian University, and I was awarded a doctoral degree in canon law in 1998. When I came back to New York, I served briefly on the Metropolitan Tribunal of the Archdiocese of New York. And after that brief stint, I was assigned as pastor of St. Vincent de Paul Church in Manhattan. And I served both English and French-speaking Catholics. I was a parish founded by French Catholic immigrants to the United States back in the 1840s. And after 14 years, I was then assigned to Holy Family Church, my current pastorate, and I've been here almost 10 years, and I'm very happy to continue parish work. I do canon law work as a sideline, advising people, and there are always a lot of questions about canon law. And then I also do media work, so I'm basically a monthly guest on Raymond Arroyo's The World Over on EWTN television with Bob Royal, the Papal Posse. I write a column at thecatholicthing.org. I also write regularly for the Human Life Review website, and then other media appearances. So, and then I guess the latest news is that I published a book in the month of April called Calming the Storm. It's an interview book with Diane Montagna, who is a Vatican journalist, and the book concerns the crises facing the Catholic Church and society. So that's a little background on myself.
We're really blessed to have you. Separated faithful are experiencing a crisis that's going on kind of worldwide about marriage. So could you just kind of from the background of what is the marriage promises that Catholics make, and how are separated faithful upholding those promises?
Yes, well, Catholic marriage, of course, is a sacrament which gives sacramental form and grace to a man and a woman who promise their vows to each other. And those vows are promised without an expiration date. In other words, they're for life, as the marriage bond comes into existence when you make your vows, and those vows are for life. Marriage, of course, is a natural institution created by God from the beginning. Adam and Eve were created one for the other. God made them male and female. So Adam and Eve in marriage became the propagators of the species, and also the ones to promote the common good for each other. So mutual assistance, which basically is love in action, serving one another in marriage, and then, God willing, when children come, together serving the children, because the propagation of species for humans does not simply involve begetting and giving birth to a child, but also to raising that child. So those marriage, that reality of marriage, right from the beginning, was sanctified by Christ, who raised to the level of a sacrament. And you remember, of course, that our Lord said, what God has joined, man must not divide. So he warned us not to seek to end the marriage covenant. And then secondly, he said, the man who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. So adultery, of course, means sexual relations by a married person with someone to whom they're not married. And that indicates quite clearly that the Lord considers that a divorce does not end the marriage. The marriage continues, therefore you're held to avoid the sin of adultery. If the marriage ended, then sexual relations outside of marriage for that person would be fornication, but it isn't. It's adultery. So, yeah, that's the nature of marriage, and it is a lifetime commitment which involves the exchange of vows in view of the marital union, in view of the sexual union of the man and the woman who have now pledged their love to each other. And it's not breakable at the request or desire of either party.
So for separated faithful, the other party is essentially requesting to break it. They're not interested in upholding the promises that they made. They say they either fell out of love, or they say, I just can't be married to you anymore. Or if in NoFault Divorce, they say the marriage is irretrievably broken, or we have irreconcilable differences. So the other spouse is just sitting there facing this in one's partner who promised them a lifelong marriage. So do you have any suggestions on how one can forgive, even though the other party just holds his position? Like, it's not a one-time incident where somebody did a horrible crime against you one time. This is just an ongoing thing that goes on kind of day after day after day. From a priest perspective, a Catholic priest perspective, what can you encourage? And how do you forgive in those circumstances?
Sure. Yes. Well, because the nature of marriage is such that once you are joined in marriage by freely making your vows, then you acquire the obligations of marriage. And the obligations involve both openness to human life, so therefore willingness to have sexual relations, and then to raise any children conceived therefrom. But it also concerns cohabitation, that you're supposed to live with your spouse and provide for their needs, provide in common for the needs of children. And the church says that those obligations need to be fulfilled on an ongoing basis. Now, there can be legitimate interruptions of cohabitation, such as the husband's in the Navy and he's on a submarine and he's got to go out to sea and you won't see him for 6 months. Those are foreseen and good because they are his way of providing for his family is by serving in the United States Navy. There could also be illness, which would require, hospitalization. So the mere fact that someone separates from the spouse for a period of time doesn't signify a neglect of marital obligations to cohabit and to be available for marital relations. On the other hand, if someone makes a decision to abandon the spouse, meaning to leave the cohabitation, not to be in the same house with them, not to engage in marital relations, and then not to support the other spouse in the way that they had been doing so previously, and which they're still capable of doing, then you have a problem. So the encouragement that I would offer to a spouse who is the wrong party, meaning the one who did not initiate the abandonment, that they have to remain faithful to their vows because they're going to give witness to the truth that their marriage continues. It's simply the obligations are not being fulfilled by one party.
And do you have any ideas on what goes on with the civil forum? Because I think in the old days we had fault-based divorce, but now in the modern times we have no-fault divorce. So a separated spouse can't really stop a separated faithful spouse who didn't want to be divorced can't really stop it. This is different than it was 40 years ago. How do you see that?
Yes, well, no-fault divorce is not a good thing because it encourages people with the thought that they can terminate a marriage and not suffer consequences in civil law that would be onerous. In other words, since no blame is being assigned by the judge in the case, the parties have to arrive at an agreement on how they will divide the property, and then what are the future financial responsibilities, and then there's joint responsibilities toward the children, things of that sort. So that, because divorce became so much of more prevalent in American society as the 20th century went on. This was a way for the legal profession, similar to, no fault car insurance for accidents, that you don't have to prove negligence necessarily. I'm not a civil lawyer, so I'm, speaking in layman's terms in that regard. But certainly, the Catholic Church teaches the civil divorce that is entered into does not end the marriage bond. It simply is a civil provision, which can even be something that the church would accept in the circumstances, meaning if getting a civil divorce was the only way for the wronged party to guarantee economic support or protection from harm, provide for the future, the just distribution of patrimony to the person and to the children, then regrettably, since the church doesn't have a coercive way to compel a spouse who has abandoned the other spouse to actually fulfill their duties, the civil government will have to do that.
Yeah, and because of no fault, this is kind of a tangent, but it's the outcomes in no fault divorce might not even be justice anyway. So a woman whose husband leaves to go have an affair might go to the civil forum to try to get support, but the husband would never be expected in the civil court to support the wife the way he had been throughout their whole marriage. Instead, they try to split everything 50-50, and if the wife doesn't agree, then she's threatened with the court could order something worse. Yeah, no fault really is not a good thing. I wanted to ask you from a priest perspective, how are we supposed to deal with injustices when we're experiencing something that's a grave injustice? And no fault's not just the only thing, but how throughout history, or do you have any encouragement, how are we supposed to deal with injustice when there's really nothing you can do about it? From someone who's a separated faithful, either at no fault or when the spouse leaves and says, I don't love you anymore, I can't be married to you anymore.
Well, yeah, injustice is, that's part of the Christian vocation, which is to learn how to both accept injustice and to fight against it. So we accept the reality that in a sinful world, harm will be done to innocent people. That's just the way it is. We also accept the reality that every one of us is capable of doing that, and therefore we have to be on guard that we don't engage in unjust actions. Now, we also have to fight against injustice because the Lord does not want, a passivism in the face of evil. If you'll recall, when Jesus was before the Sanhedrin and one of the guards slapped him in the face because of something he had told the Sanhedrin and the high priest, the Lord said, "Why do you strike me?" So the Lord was challenging this unjust action of striking him for the words he had spoken. And that's an example for us that we should not think that in the face of injustice, I have to remain silent or somehow accept it as being, part of being a good Christian is to pretend everything's fine. No, we can recognize injustice but what you have to avoid is a bitter spirit or a rebellion against divine providence, which would say, God can't be good if he let me suffer this. Because, the Lord Jesus Christ himself suffered an unjust death for our sake, and the martyrs similarly throughout Christian history. St. Maximilian Kolbe went to his death in order to spare a married man with children from retribution killing by the Nazi guards in Auschwitz. So, he was a victim of injustice, but by virtue of it, he's a saint. So sanctity is promoted when we incorporate, our suffering, which is unjust suffering, but nonetheless something that we're called to bear.
There's lots of opportunities for that, for those who are on the receiving end of abandonment or a no-fault divorce. Another problem that these separated faithful face is there's a lot of pressure from acquaintances, from the civil court system, from lawyers, even from the other spouse who doesn't want to stay together anymore. There's a lot of pressure to just accept that you have to move on. You have to go find a new partner. You deserve to be happy. Come on, you're not really married anymore. Your marriage is dead. Why don't you accept it? Um, do you have any thoughts on what one could use for rebuttals for that kind of talk?
Yeah, well, the rebuttal begins at the day the wedding vows were exchanged, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, till sickness and health, till death do us part. No one compelled either party in the marriage, barring contrary evidence, no one compelled them to make that statement. In other words, they freely vowed themselves to their husband or wife for life and in circumstances that were both happy and sad. So, yeah, so the marriage isn't dead. What's happened is one of the partners, and we're talking about the case of an abandonment, but there can also be a mutual agreement, sad to say, of people to end their marriage. Marriage isn't ended by mutual agreement. So there is, a reality that is invisible but true called the marriage bond, which it doesn't depend for its continuance on the ongoing assent of the parties, of the husband and the wife. Once you swear your vows, you're married, and that marriage is presumed valid in law until the death of one of the parties or till a finding by ecclesiastical tribunal that the marriage was invalid for some reason. So, yeah, people should not say, well, I guess everybody's right. My marriage is dead, and therefore I'm free to marry someone else. And it might be a nice idea to do that. No, you're not free to marry someone else, and your happiness will be in fulfilling your promise because you made it in the sight of God, and God is the reason why you made that promise for life.
One of the things that separated faithful tell me that they're disheartened about is when people, even who look like serious Catholics, say, well, there's nothing wrong with your spouse, your husband or wife divorcing you. There's nothing wrong with them doing that. It's okay. The only thing that's wrong is if they were to remarry without an annulment. And I wonder, do you know how the church used to respond to separation and divorce decades or centuries ago? Is something different now such that serious Catholics say things like, there's nothing wrong with divorce in all circumstances?
Well, I think people say that because they want to be nice to the both parties in the marriage, and so they basically say, well, things didn't work out, and maybe this is best for everybody. People weren't up to the demand, up to the obligations they assumed. In other words, excuse making plus, friendly banter kind of statements. But it's not the case. The Catholic Church teaches the marriage is still valid, and it's presumed valid in law, meaning that the married parties don't have to prove that they're married. Someone who is seeking a declaration of nullity has the onus to prove that the marriage is not valid, because if they got married in church following, the prescriptions of canon law, then the marriage is presumed valid. So, in the past, it exists in canon law, which is an ecclesiastical separation. In other words, that the church will recognize the right of one of the parties to not cohabit with the other, and this would be for a serious reason. So let's say you did have two spouses, and then the man was threatening the woman with physical abuse, or let's say irresponsible behavior that was risky for the health and welfare of the children or the wife. Then the wife could petition to get a decree of separation from the bishop, so that it would be publicly recognized by the community that she was not abandoning her husband. And that's important in an all-Catholic society in which there is no divorce. How is it that a husband and wife would be living apart for an extended period of time, unrelated to, let's say, a vacation travel or something, but basically because of circumstances that, the aggrieved party was able to demonstrate to the bishop? Now, we don't do that anymore because in the divorce culture, nobody, the level of scandal is very much reduced, and it's such a common thing these days. But the onus is on the party who doesn't want to be divorced to make it clear to anybody who knows the situation of that person that they are separated for good reason.
This another question. It's from a totally different angle, and it has to do with praying and hoping and not getting what one's praying for. So this isn't unique to people who are separated faithful, but do you have any way to explain how one can balance praying that a marriage be reconciled from this perspective as this faithful spouse, praying that the marriage be reconciled, while the other spouse is showing no human signs of anything? They might even be civilly married to somebody else. How does one balance praying for reconciliation and hoping that it occurs and not falling into despair, but the person praying isn't seeing the results of what they're asking for? They're just getting nothing.
Right. Well, since marriage involves the free will of two parties, the only thing that one person has is control over their own decision making, not of the other person. So we can pray that God will influence them, and then we can try to influence them by our behavior. So being faithful and not remarrying and telling, the other party, marriage still exists and we should reestablish cohabitation and marital life, common life. That's a good encouragement, and then pray to God the person will accept it. But as you say, sometimes the other party has already entered into a new, a civil marriage, second marriage. Maybe they went to a Protestant church and got married, with a minister or whatever. That makes it more difficult because there's a second person involved now in that with the spouse who has departed. So we pray for the things we know are good, but we leave it up to God whether in His providence it's actually going to come about. Because in this case, it involves a decision by the other party, which is becoming, as you say, maybe no human sign of that person even being interested in considering it.
Do you think it does observers any good to know someone's being faithful, or do they kind of look like someone that's crazy? Like I'm thinking
No. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it does a great amount of good. People that know that you are faithful to your marriage vows are, they're inspired because they know you're doing the right thing. Those that know your circumstances, others who discover it later will realize that this is a person who has not, gone along with the social trend of divorce and remarriage. So, yeah, I think it's very inspiring.
Faithful too. I want to swing to something you said earlier when you were talking about the church canon law assumes that all marriages are valid until proven otherwise. In some dioceses, the statistics that are published about their granting of decrees of an invalidity show that they grant 100% of the petitioners an annulment. I mean, that's what people call it, but technically that's not what it is. It's a decree of invalidity. So I do know, I'm thinking of a woman out east who her husband did petition for a degree of invalidity, and even after going through a long process, she couldn't get the judges to change their mind, and an annulment was granted. But she doesn't believe it's real. She thinks it's mistaken. Is there anything wrong for someone who is in that position where even though a tribunal says the marriage is invalid, from what the person knows about their own situation and what they've seen in the case, they just can't accept it? Is there anything wrong with holding that position?
Not at all, because remember that the judgment of the tribunal is a legal finding. So the legal finding is the judges arriving at a conclusion based on the evidence that they've considered, and then they're applying the law to that evidence. So maybe there's new evidence that can be presented to refute conclusions the judges arrived at in their decision, because judges are supposed to are required to write out by law a decree explaining the reason why they grant the petition for decree of nullity. Now, also, the law is that there's no offense given if you continue to claim that you don't believe that the decree of nullity is valid, meaning that you think it's an incorrect decision. But you have to consider the arguments that the judges raised, because maybe there is an invalidity there. And it doesn't. Both parties agreed by marrying in the church to submit to the marriage law of the church. And that's actually, Catholics have an obligation by being Catholic to submit to the authority of the church. And in these matters, it's regulated by canon law. So, if you lose your trial, you lose your petition, that the claim you make in your petition, you're bound to that decision by the legal authority. Doesn't mean you agree with it, and you certainly shouldn't act contrary to it, because then that's that's sinful behavior.
So the husband asking contrary to it, going to find a new girlfriend, he is declared to have a valid marriage and he's out with someone else.
Yeah, that's wrong. He can do that.
And then the woman, if she thinks her marriage is valid and the church judged it to be invalid, I'm sorry. She thinks it's valid. The church judged it to be invalid. All she's doing is remaining alone and not finding a new person and believing that her marriage is valid.
Yeah, she's entitled. I mean, she can do that, and that's, praiseworthy. On the other hand, if she decides that she would like to, now that marriage is declared invalid, she'd like to marry someone else, the church will say, fine, you can do that.
All right.
Because tribunal findings are human judgments which are subject to error. But you are entitled to act once a legal finding has been made. But that doesn't mean you have to act. If you still say, I still disagree with that decision, so I'm not going to remarry, then that's praiseworthy.
All right. Well, that was a lot more complicated. It's hard to explain simply, but thank you for going through that with me. We're kind of at the end of our time. Do you have any closing encouragement or inspiration to share with people who are in this situation?
Yes, no, I admire people who are the aggrieved party, meaning that they don't want the marriage to end, and they're willing to try to do everything they can to help it stay together, but the other party decided they want out. So admire those who remain faithful to their vows and do not, go along with the idea that I'm just going to agree to this, the marriage is dead, and everybody's going to go away, forget about it. No, defend the validity of your marriage, and if a canonical case is raised, look at the evidence, because, the fact that someone is an aggrieved party where the other leaves doesn't necessarily mean that the other party might not have a just claim to a cause of nullity, because it might be on their side the cause of nullity. Because, that's what the evidence is supposed to bring forward.